Hello, my name is Mantle. Along with my co-author, Ron Lichty, we spent years distilling our experience managing software people and teams and created our book, Managing Unmanageable, published by Addison Whistley Pearson in a fairly recent published second edition. Today, I want to share some insights into managing remote software development. By the way, visit the website we created for the book. You'll find lots of additional information there, including lots of more rules of thumb, one of the best parts of the book, in my opinion. So first, let me tell you a little bit about me. I've been developing hardware and software for over 50 years at a variety of companies. All of them were startups when I started, but they all became large companies, or at least successful companies, and continue to this very day. Over that period of time, I've been managing people and projects and teams and organizations in countries throughout the world, and working with dozens and dozens of customers, large companies, small companies, and others. But I never imagined a world where remote is complete reality, but at least one person did. Arthur C. Clarke in 1974. But it took a worldwide pandemic to make Arthur C. Clarke's vision of the world a reality. And it's clearly a reality for software people who are working remotely today. We all know that managing programmers is hard, but managing them now is even harder. We recounted many of the reasons for that and what to do to make it easier in our book. All this information is still valid, but now managing programmers and teams and organizations is even harder. Almost 60% of the total US workforce are remote workers. This is mirrored around the world. And many global companies are fully remote now. Unfortunately, these numbers will likely continue to grow if the pandemic continues. If it doesn't, well, those numbers will begin to come down. But managers have to find ways to manage remote workers effectively. They've got to expand their skills and manage remote teams and organizations more effectively. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Time, distance, and culture difference complicate any remote relationships. I learned my lessons about time, distance, culture, managing people and teams 8 to 12.5 hours distant and a half a world away in Russia, Japan, and India. Somebody has to be inconvenienced whenever you're working that way. The challenges of meeting directly were impacted by these distances, as well as the cultural difference of language, backgrounds, values, and even different holidays. Here's a little bit of what I learned. With time, you have to work hard to make sure that your working hours and the teams overlap. Hiring remote workers in a disparate time zones will only make your job harder. Distance shouldn't matter, but it does. Occasionally travel is important, and if the distance is too far, you don't undertake it. If you put people in remote places, they don't have access to major airports or access to travel easily, well, then that make travel much more difficult. With culture, differences can impair communication, especially understanding, and national holiday differences can impede your schedules. Having people work together is hard when they take major blocks of time off. I found that out with India and Japan especially. And expectations are going to differ among cultures. My recommendation is to hire staff with time, distance, culture foremost in mind. It's important to make sure that every remote worker's equipment and workspace be adequate for their performance level. You have to work to make sure that they have the right equipment in hand, that it's set up appropriately. And also, you have to double down to make sure that a personal connection is maintained with these remote workers. one-on-one meetings, informal chats, and personal visits whenever possible. Also, never overlook the fact that you need formal, quarterly, and annual feedback. However, you've got to look for clues about not insignificant, but significant variances in a worker's performance, in communication, in focus, in work records, and especially interaction with teammates and peers. You have to trust your workers, but remember, trust but verify, one of our favorite rules of thumb from our book. I've been burned once too many times by people I trusted completely. Be on the lookout for clues that make you wonder if everything is the way it seems or is reported. So this comic made me laugh when I saw it. As workers work remotely, what they can say that may not really be true. In today's age of widespread security hacks and issues, your remote workers must have a secure environment. With an unsecured facility and family access as a work environment, this is even more important and not a detail to be overlooked. Make sure that you do. A study of Microsoft employees in the US showed that they really stopped talking to each other, the teams, during the pandemic. The workers became siloed. So you've got to ensure your remote workers keep their lines of communication open with their managers, their teammates, and everyone else throughout the company. After all, if it can happen to Microsoft, it can happen to you. You've got to make sure every remote worker understands the responsibility to make working remotely effective, productive, and successful. Reinforce this every opportunity you can, especially in your one-on-ones and quarterly annual reviews. Remote workers have responsibilities they must and should do. They have to continue to add value to everything they do and to make sure they spotlight their own contributions. Meetings are always an important part of the landscape, and they've taken on an even more important part during the pandemic. Remote workers have to prepare for meetings even more rigorously than they did before. They have to maintain a vigorous and vibrant presence during these meetings to remind people that they are vital workers and play an important role. Most of all, they've got to be there. They've got to be there for their teammates who rely on them for lots of things. So it's important to find ways to show them that you're there for them in every way possible. Managing remote workers is hard, but managing remote teams is even harder. Every manager, no matter how experienced, needs to expand their skills and tools to manage remote teams and organizations effectively. GitLab has a lot to offer as an example. GitLab is an amazing company. They've been working 100% remote since their inception. And also, it's amazing that they're completely open about what they do and how they do it. One thing to look at, GitLab's remote manifesto. Like the Agile manifesto, it spells out how they want their workers and everyone else to view them. These are the 9 rules that they think are important for them. And it touches on lots of things that I've noticed working with remote workers all over the world as well. This is something to look at and embrace. They also have a remote work report. I recommend you download it, read it, and learn from it as well. They also have a remote playbook, which is very useful. You can download the playbook and learn how their team members from around the world have been contributing to the company. Last but not least, take the GitLab course, How to Manage a Remote Team. It's free and available online. In it, you'll find 5 different sections which talk about how to take and go about managing a remote team and provides exercises to help you do this effectively. To learn more about GitLab, I reached out to two people who used to work for me. They worked for me for a long time, many years. They were directors in the company I worked for then. I asked them what it was like to work for GitLab, and knowing how their work experience was and their background, I was interested to see what kind of things they would say. Here's what they had to say. They both loved working at GitLab. They both found it challenging with the time zones, but the thing they both reiterated was that async communications incredibly important at GitLab. They use lots of tools. Most are pretty familiar, but they rely a lot on Slack, Zoom, Google Docs, Calendly, a fairly small tool bag considering what's out there today. Also, it's a great meeting culture. They don't have meetings just to discuss status. They have meetings to make decisions. Meetings start and end on time, and there must be an agenda. At GitLab, Monday through Thursdays are for virtual meetings. Fridays a no meeting day, time to get their own work done. This GitLab handbook, which you can download from their site as well. Of course, it's like 17,000 pages long by now, contains everything: company culture, values, and operational procedures. One of the comments this fellow told me was, it only works if you keep it up to date. Things can get out of date, and unfortunately, there's no way to know when something changes. So if you're going to do something important that's actionable, driven by the handbook, it's best to check back with it. But everything is expected to be documented. But one of the most telling things I heard was that the middle management is the glue that holds everything together. Now, that's true in many companies. I didn't expect it to be as true at GitLab. So moving past GitLab, there's a lot of tools to help remote communications among teams, to help them collaborate better. You know most of these. We're using one of them now, Zoom, to record this presentation. Slack, Google Meet, Microsoft Teams lead the way among a lot of these tools. There are also many other tools, too many to list here, that have their own set of people who favor them. Recently, Google announced Google Workspace, and it's trying to raise the bar in competition with Microsoft Office, of course. I wasn't aware what it was. I had to go look it up. It contains all the Google apps, from Gmail to Forms. And they put it all in one convenient bundle where there's 3 different price tiers, depending upon how big the organization is and how much of the resources, i.e. bandwidth and storage, you use. Interestingly, they've also created a series of kits, which they sell, to take and make video conferencing more easy. So I found this interesting. So Google, start my meeting. They're trying to out Alexa Amazon, I assume. So they have these kits, and they partnered with Lenovo, and to take and market it and sell it. The prices are not exorbitant, so small companies can easily afford it, and it's maybe even be good for an upscale home office. But unfortunately, such tools don't really help you manage remote teams. For years, I've been looking for tools to help me manage programmers, teams, and projects better. I was so desperate that once I even tried developing a set of software to help me do this on my own. But those efforts fell away due to work pressures by my other jobs. A new generation of dev analytics tools are emerging that provide actionable data that you can actually use to understand your projects better. One example is a project in GitHub called Visualizing a Code Base. It digests a repo in GitLab or GitHub and produces a diagram that shows you the organization of a project. It's not documentation per se, but you can learn a lot by looking at it. For example, if you look closely, the circles that are self-contained bits of a project. Within the circles, the size of the circles indicate the size of the files that make up that project. And each of the files are color-coded depending upon the file type, so you can get a sense for exactly what kind of code is in your project. This is the kind of tool I was looking for years to help me understand so I could question what's going on when I see things starting to go awry. It's just the beginning, but it shows great promise. You know, software is hard to manage because it's so intangible. I look at things like visualizing the code base and think that it can help us understand what a project is like overall, but it doesn't help me in trying to manage exactly what's going on in a project. You have to dive into code to figure that out. You have to figure out how much code is created, modified, reviewed, completed, tested, and most important, how the code relates to the project. There's a new generation of other dev analytics tools that take and help solve this problem. There are many of them out there. Here's the set I've been looking at, trying to understand which tools work the best. The way these tools work is they digest the repository that is your source code, i.e. from GitHub or GitLab, and derive on-demand charts, graphs, and reports to help you figure out exactly what's going on and what the current status and progress is. Waydev, one of these companies, is a good example of such a tool. They provide many different metrics, including these I've shown here. And they do it in such a way that can actually understand them. This is the way they explain it to their customers. There are repositories over on your left. There are places where ticket activities occur, Jira and GitHub. There's continuous integration, continuous development activities in the third area. And finally, calendar meetings, which integrated into a set of reports which no manual inputs required, and the data is aggregated in real time, making reports available that are never out of date by more than a day, which may be the turnaround time to get the data ingested and reports generated. Here's an example of one of the reports, which just shows exactly what's going on in terms of the code commits, the merge commits, the pull requests, the pulls requests merge, the comments, the reviews, and it shows these by size so that you can determine exactly what's going on for each of the developers in this particular team. You can see how many they've done, and the size, the number is indicated by the size of the circle or diamond shape you see. Now, this provides a lot of insight. You have to look at it closely. You have to look beyond just the graphs, understand what's going on. But using these can help you, for example, do in your daily stand-ups and in your one-on-ones with your developers to ask what is happening, to compliment on the work that's been done, and to understand what work they expect to be done in the future. So these are just one example of a lot of the different tools out there. They're continuing to improve, and what doesn't work for you today may be important for you months later. So you as a manager have to be constantly on the lookout for any tools that provide insight into what your remote team's activities and progress can be. Adopting the right tools make managing remote teams easier. Indeed, they may make it even possible. And companies that embrace these dev analytics tools may even provide a competitive advantage to themselves. So to recap, as we focus on managing remote workers effectively, make sure your communication is high bandwidth. Maintain a personal connection with all your developers. And provide the best work environment and tools that you can. To manage remote teams more effectively, managers must continue to expand their skills and tool set. They've got to look to good examples like GitLab to learn what they can on how to do it effectively. And they've got to embrace any and all tools that make managing remote people and teams easier. I hope these insights that I've shared with you today will help you manage your remote people, remote teams, and organizations better. I've enjoyed sharing these with you, and I hope that you do remember that managing remote people and teams doesn't have to be unmanageable. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mickey, for that interesting presentation on managing remote software development, which feels quite apropos because your panel here is geographically dispersed across actually the West Coast. We're in the same time zone, but we're spread many thousand miles apart right now. Mickey, there have been a few questions that have come up that some of them came again ahead of time for people who couldn't attend this live session, and some that popped up in the chat. Let me start off with asking you a question about time, distance, and culture. You say they're important. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. When I was talking to one of the GitLab managers, directors I quoted in the presentation, he started out my, when I first started talking to him, he said, I want to thank you for giving me a piece of information when I work for you that has been the most important thing for me during my employment at GitLab. He says that was time, the importance of time, distance, and culture. He says, I've used that so much. And so really what's so important about it is that when you go to hire someone, or if they're hired and you have to interact with them, understanding how much time can impact that interaction, okay, if they're half a world away, excuse me, as it was when I was managing teams in India, 12 and a half hours away, somebody was always inconvenienced if we wanted to talk directly. So a lot of communication via email, but you really have to have high bandwidth communication to be effective on occasion. So, the time is important. The distance, of course, is less important when everybody's remote, except for the fact that sometimes you want to be together. One of the most important things I ever learned, at least as a personal lesson from me, was that when I take and have to really understand someone, I can do it via remote, I can do it via phone, I can do it via Zoom, but taking and having eye-to-eye communication in person over dinner or just a meeting, thereafter, somehow the communication is always easier. Mm-hmm. So the distance is important, and you want to take and be able to actually have live conversations whenever it's possible. Hopefully in the next coming months and years, it'll be more possible than it is now even. And finally, culture. Well, of course, culture in this particular context is the culture of the person you're talking to or you're dealing with. Understanding the cultural differences in India, the differences in Japan, and trying to use those to make sure that you're not doing faux pas in their culture, and to understand when they don't understand your culture. So the cultural aspect here is very important. Now, Ron earlier talked about company culture. Now that's different than the culture I'm talking about here. Also very important, but the culture here is more about the individual's culture.
Right, and that seems to me to be one of the more difficult of those challenges that you listed. Cultural alignment seems to be the most difficult, actually, for me. Like, okay, now I recognize that there's different cultures for the norms in India, other countries, even within the US, different populations. What any advice on how to one to understand the different cultures and expectations, and then how to align teams to a common culture?
Well, that's to me is challenging. I think the most important is to take and make sure you have a set of values set for your company that help define the culture. If you go into our book, you actually, we talk about sometimes you have to wall off the culture of your company and create your own set of values and the culture in the group you're managing. Because if the company culture is toxic to what you're doing, you don't want to bring that in. You want to wall it off. So establishing the cultures that represent the values you have, then trying to get others in these remote teams that they can embrace those cultures and abide by them. I think that's the best you can do.
I think I'd add one note, which is holidays. So one of the things you find out when you start managing people in other countries is they have different holidays. And those holidays can be revealing about culture, and so that's interesting from that standpoint.
Yeah, and also just while you're mentioning holidays, understanding those holidays and actually mapping them out. Because, for example, I always had to take and almost wall off January as a development period because in India and in China, much of January is taken off as a holiday. So you have to take and understand those things when you're trying to make plans around your teams that may not be in those places.
And the summertime in Europe is interesting. I'll use my mother's use of the word interesting. Summertime in Europe is interesting.
Yes,
sure.
August. Yeah, Europe in August.
Europe in August.
Yeah. And so you mentioned, Nikki, about the importance of a good internet connection. Maybe we can reflect a little bit more on the hardware you talked about. You brought up Google sort of several $1,000 room audio kits. How important is audio visual equipment? Is there any kind of minimum that you think is important? And let me add that we have CDDD, which I believe is Cortland, has some opinions on that. He feels that audio quality is sometimes overlooked, which means the microphones, the headsets, the earbuds I'm wearing now, and the treatment for room acoustics. And for Cortland, for instance, he uses, for his day-to-day use, he uses a headset, a mic on a boom, which is attached to headphones. Can you speak a little bit about having sort of like a good audio setup for your remote individuals on your team?
Sure, I'll give you an example of this. I learned very quickly when we were doing animations and video is that if you can't keep up to the video, you got to make sure the audio never drops out. So the audio always has priority over video. So paying attention to audio is a very good thing. It's the most important aspect of it. Now, today it's amazing what you can get for very little. I recently upgraded the camera I'm looking at now, and I think it cost me less than $100. That was an upgrade. Just a high def camera that goes, and I'm using for Zoom. The audio, I can't speak to it because you're listening to it and I'm not, but I think it's okay. But I agree that people should take and invest in quality equipment if they're going to be online doing remote teams like we're doing all of us in the world, it seems like nowadays. Don't scrimp on that.
Yeah, I was in a meeting of folks who were probably not, it's just one of these Zoom meetings, but the team isn't particularly technology aware. And one of the people in the meeting, I was the new person who joined. He's like, "Oh my God, your audio is so good. What do you do?" I was like, "Well, just have earbuds. Everybody else was using the mic and the speaker in their laptops. And small things like that can make really big differences.
Indeed.
Yeah, another question from Cortland is, and perhaps maybe we can figure out how to make a little sense of it, is comments on the difference between espoused values, like values and action. Can either you, Ron, or Mickey try to see what he's getting at there?
So I think it goes, if we go back and revisit what Ron was talking about earlier about Enron, okay, they espoused a lot of values, okay, but they didn't live them. In fact, they were 180 degrees opposite often in the way they ran their company. So taking and understanding the values that are espoused and the values you actually want to see. For example, you may not want your teams to emulate the way your managers work or the CEO works. Maybe he doesn't embrace the values, even though he espouses them. So, actions often speak louder than words. So make sure that you follow the values and you are leadership in being and embodying the values that you really want to embrace.
Yeah, I'll give you another example. When I was at Charles Schwab, and I was at Charles Schwab for almost 7 years, Schwab had wonderful values that in my experience, at least at that time, that Schwab lived those values. And there are values like fairness and values of teamwork and values of relentlessly delivering value to our customers. And I was leading an initiative at one point at Schwab. I was leading an initiative for our CIO to basically create teamwork across all of the software development organization. So across 1,500 software developers who up until that point had been able to choose any software they wanted, any platform they wanted. So you can imagine our data center was supporting Microsoft technologies and Java technologies and C++ and pretty much every language that existed other than Spitball and Snowball. I'm pretty sure we didn't have any Spitball or Snowball in our data center, but pretty much everything else. And so we were trying to unify that. And one of the things that I was trying to create was this environment. It was a culture of sharing. Culture of sharing fit very well with some of those values, but the relentless delivery of software too often caused developers to put on blinders, like the horse blinders that we see from the 1800s, put on blinders and not learn from the very developer who was sitting next to them, not share what they were learning with the developer sitting next to them. And so what I then found having to do was to emphasize one value over another, and that value of teamwork I had to emphasize over the value of relentlessly delivering software to our customers, because ultimately that culture of sharing was going to result over the middle and long term in delivering much more software to our customers by not blocking ourselves off from each other.
And probably better software.
And that too.
Yeah, Cortland's is chiming in, agreeing with you in some sense that values and action really come to play when you have those difficult situations. And research shows that there can be a gap between espousing and living to your values when things are running easily and then when things get really tough. But let me follow on this sort of tool thing that you brought up, Ron. One of the things I found is challenging is introducing a new tool. So as a manager, as a leader, and you talk some of these dev analytics tools, Mickey, there's a whole bunch of them we could talk about, but let's say you as a manager wants to bring in a new tool or use a new tool. Can you talk to what it takes to get your team to buy into using this new tool and feel comfortable using the tool and spending the time to learn how to use it? Can you talk about introducing a new tool and making it effective in your team?
Well, I'll back up a little bit. Before you bring in a tool, make sure your organization is ready for the tool as well. For example, if there's cost, you better make sure it's budgeted and that your CFO has bought into it as well. So if you don't have buy-in from the company, going in and spending a lot of time on a tool, which they then won't support and purchase, is needless. So save your time and money, or money you don't have, I guess. But going back to what you do with tools, you know, in your team, and especially with some of these dev analytics tools, the team could feel that you don't trust them. They feel like they don't,
Right, right.
you're trying to spy on them. But
Right.
really, you're not. You're trying to help them be better. The analogy I like to use for these kind of tools is, if you look at the sports world today, okay, any baseball game, any football game, it's any tennis game, any golf game, you look at those games and it's filled with information about how the team or the individual is doing. Okay, do you think these players push back at that? No, they actually embrace it because it helps them be better people, better players. And so if your team as software programmers feel that these tools are kind of giving too much information they don't want to share, well, they should embrace it as a way to help them be better programmers. So you have to educate them. You've got to be careful on becoming heavy-handed with it in any way. You know, these tools, it depends on which ones you choose, but they can be very illuminating, help you do management of these projects better and faster and more effectively. But if they're heavy-handed, it's going to take and lower the morale of your team and cause problems in another area. So there's a careful balance here, but go slow and take your time, and don't try to change 180 degrees overnight. By the way, learning these tools is not easy. It takes a long time to take and ramp up on them. So embrace them is not something to be undertaken lightly.
Yes. So two questions. One is, can you get sort of unintended consequences from the tools? I looked at the presentation where you talk about they have circles and diamonds, and there's these little circles and these big circles. And as a software developer, I want to have big circles. And can that create sort of perhaps like code bloat, or depends on how the tool measures it, or like unintended consequences of this measurement?
Right, right. So one of the fears of these kinds of tools is you're going to be rewarding the wrong things. I was reading a post the other day. Someone said, if I use this, then all of the changes, I had a developer who went back and created more aligned to all the comments in all of the code. Okay, so they're not meaningful changes, but it showed he had done a bunch of changes. Right. So you can't just look at the numbers. You've got to look beyond them. Okay. But if you're trying to help the team, okay, you're going to know that this guy, he couldn't make that many changes. He's not our top developer. He's off commenting code. I'm going to ignore that. But then look at the people who actually are contributing and see how they're doing. So, you know, you have to work it out. But I think that it's the kind of tool that was well worth the time and effort you have to spend to take and do it right.
Yeah,
we're edging into we're actually a little more edged into than edging into the topic of metrics. One of my more recent blog posts began with the words, "Don't ever, ever, ever let velocity be used as a measure of productivity or performance." And the reason, one of the reasons for that is so I shared this with a client in Arizona, and the client, the group of people just lit up. They said, "Oh yeah, we've got a rule of thumb for that. What gets measured gets manipulated."
Mm-hmm.
And it's the best, one of the most concise rules of thumb I think I've run across is what gets measured gets manipulated. And what happens with velocity is, if someone outside the team starts measuring velocity, starts watching velocity, and the team becomes aware of that, they will start manipulating it. And you can make velocity go up really fast. All you have to do is change the point sizes on your stories. And velocity will up. The number of stories that are getting done, the amount of delight of our customers, the outcomes, nothing changes, but velocity goes up. And it's a bad thing. And side effect of that is that because velocity is now manipulated, velocity is no longer useful as a measure for the team to use to be predictable. And so the
Can I
team
make a counterpoint to that, Ron?
Yes, please
Okay,
do.
that point of view is very cynical. You believe that your team doesn't want to improve. Do you think that velocity, knowing how your velocity is doing, isn't a valid thing to understand?
Yes, so the team. So that was my point. Don't ever let it be used outside of the team. The team needs velocity in order to be predictable. The team needs velocity in order to understand how it's doing.
So you as your manager, are you part of the team or not?
The team needs that internal feedback. So I started a blog post, or started a discussion group on this a year ago or so, and one of the contributors said, we don't let velocity leak outside of the team. And I thought that was a really useful way of putting it. Is we don't let it leak outside the team. We use it really validly and usefully inside the team.
So you as a manager shouldn't know about it?
So it depends on the instance of Agile, whether I'm part of the team or not. But as part of, so we're sort of part of the team and sort of not part of the team. And so
is that yes or no?
letting the management outside of our organization, letting the CEO know about it, letting sales know.
Promoting it as a valuable measure. Yes, don't promote it. I absolutely agree. But you as a manager can use it as a useful tool.
Yeah, and as a useful tool for the team's learning.
Yes, for the team.
Yeah.
So we're in heated agreement.
I think we're in violent agreement, Nikki, as we usually are.
All right, so here's another question. You talked, Mickey, about trust but verified. And so to what extent, well, can you talk a little bit more about that? And in the extent you want to build trust with your team, but then you're verifying that they've done what they said they were going to do, it seems like that's a conflict.
Oh, not at all. So let me give you an example, a couple of examples. First of all, one, which I don't think I've ever shared in public before, my experience with one of my companies. So I was part of the executive team, and as such, we looked at financial reports once a month and understood things. And one day, our banker called, said, we're worried. A venture capitalist, one of our VCs on the board, called to say, we just got a call from your bank, and they said they were not going to be able to make payroll. We said, we just had a meeting, and our accountant said that the payroll, we had plenty of money in the bank to pay payroll. So we went to talk to the accountant, and he had left with his laptop that morning and hadn't come back from lunch yet, which was several hours later. Well, it turns out this accountant had been writing checks personal to himself and not keeping track, not making them visible to the accounting system. Okay, so we trusted this guy, but we didn't ever verify it. We immediately implemented rules whereby no one could write a check without two signatures. Okay, so that's a result of that trust but verify. Going back to programmers, which is a little bit smaller sort of situation, I had an awareness of someone who was working, they were a friend of mine, but they were working remotely for a company full-time on the East Coast. And they worked every day. They got up early and they worked, for the company. But it turns out they also had a full-time job with a company here on the West Coast. Okay, so they were working two full-time jobs, basically 16 hours a day, for which they were really only working maybe 12. Okay, so someone should have noticed that there was something wrong here. Either one of those companies, they did it for years and got away. So they were looking at results, which is good. But I don't believe they ever got the full amount of result they could have got from this person. So sometimes you got to look at the tea leaves to try to understand, okay, this person says what they're saying, but is it really happening? And that's this cartoon I put up on the in the presentation kind of alluded to that. I'm completely swamped. Okay, well, they're in the swamp, right? So sometimes you have to look beyond what people say. You have to trust them, but sometimes you have to verify too.
Ron, do you have anything to add to that since you guys were in violent agreement before? Is that?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that Amy Edmondson said about we're not just trying to create a culture of psychological safety. We're also setting standards and standards of expectation for our teams, and those are standards that we're going to verify against, that we're going to get confirmation of.
Now, let me loop back to one more question on tools. Mickey, you showed a large number of dev analytics tools. And if I've bought into something this is important for my team and I want to do it, it seems like there's like just an overwhelming number of choices, and I can spend way too much time like trying to decide which tool to pick and do an evaluation of them. Or if we take a step back to like, I want to do dev analytics, but I don't want to spend huge amounts of time picking a tool. Do you have any advice for how to go about taking that first step?
Well, so I've been trying to understand these tools myself. I'm far from understanding all of them, that's for sure. But I found this particular link I put up there is kind of useful, which is an analysis mostly from customer reviews, okay, a ranking of the best tools in this particular space. So customer reviews count for a lot. So that's one place to go to look for some guidance. But I think that going beyond that, one of the things you have to do as you take and evaluate a tool is you have to see what they say and what it actually does. And the only way to really do that is to ask for a couple of references and talk to the people who are using it.
And that's not different from are we choosing a language? Are we choosing a platform? Are we choosing a framework? We getting those references, getting those customer reviews, getting insight into it. It starts with what it is we're trying to get out of that tool. And all of the people on this call probably have some subtle differences between what it is we're trying to get out of that kind of a tool. And so we need to start with the requirements. Right.
And also make sure you do a test project. Don't just jump in feet first, into the deep end of the pool. Wade in through the shallow end and take and make sure you understand the tool and do it on a small number of things, not a big number of things. That's my recommendation.
And we have a couple more comments in our chat about getting back to culture and leadership, and particularly one of the cultures that got picked up was the Indian culture, where there's the expectation that the manager is a leader and in control, and perhaps different than some of the other cultures that come out of more global countries, or from a more mix of them. Is there kind of any other, particularly if you're working with a culture, that the expectation within that culture is strong leadership, but it's our desire to build, what's the Aristotle project from the Google about equal communication? I thought that was really interesting, Ron, that Google's high performing teams, everyone spent sort of equal amount of time talking. How do you sort of work with some cultures that don't consider that to be strong leadership, where other perhaps really analytically different given companies like Google say, well, actually that's what works best?
Well, quite frankly, let me just jump in for a second. Maybe Ron can pick it up after that, but I think that what's best for you isn't necessarily what Google says. What works for a company with unlimited dollars, okay, and an unlimited number of people isn't necessarily good for a startup. So be careful about emulating Google in all things. That said, in this particular thing, it might make sense to take and make your teams more communicate better. But I think you have to be careful emulating Google, Microsoft, Apple, these companies with $1 trillion market cap and unlimited funds and so forth.
So I'm going to disagree with Mickey on this one. On this particular point, that I think that equality and conversational turn taking is a useful measure regardless of where our team is. I've talked to a ton of startup startup managers and startup directors and VPs of engineering and CTOs. And about that question, Tammy, which is, how do we bring that kind of conversational turn taking to other cultures? And what I find is that that while the culture itself may support something different, we can find those people who are those programmers for our teams who have that, who are willing to step up and be proactive and be part of a self-organizing team. And we can find people who are reticent to do that here in the United States as well. And if that's the team, and it goes back to requirements, if that's the team we're trying to build, then maybe some of you want to build micromanaged teams. I hope not. I hope not for the benefit of your teams. But what are your requirements for your team? Those are the requirements that we need to look for in the managers we hire for those teams and in the programmers who are going to be part of those teams. So I often talk to Agile, to startups more often than not, but also to very large companies. If you brought in a summer intern, that equality and conversational turn taking applies to the summer intern as well. And it's not because the summer intern is going to architect your system, although I've had some pretty remarkable summer interns, but probably they're not going to architect the whole system. But if you don't have an intern who is bringing some experience and some expertise and cannot step up and share that at the appropriate time when that expertise or experience might be useful to your team, if they don't have that something extra, you probably hired the wrong intern.
Yep. Yes, I've had some excellent internships too. So Mickey, question for you directly from Frank. Any suggestions on how to pick remote teams, e.g. teams in India, to help startups? And I assume this is a startup here in the US and needs extra engineering help and is looking to find a remote team in India to help them. Any suggestions on how to pick them?
Well, so I have, it's been quite a number of years since I was managing teams in India, so things have progressed a long ways. So I think that understanding what their core competencies are there is key, okay? And making sure you bring those core competencies into your team if you need them. And if those core competencies don't align with your needs, then they're probably not the right team. So it's like hiring a person on steroids to hire a team or a team of programmers in India or any other place, quite frankly. You've got to be very careful about what you do. And again, wade in from the shallow end of the pool. Don't just dive into the deep end. You've got to start and be able to back off and terminate a contract if necessary, if it's not working out. And don't be afraid to do that.
And if you're hiring a team from anywhere, whether they're in the United States or whether they're in Canada or whether they're in India or China or Eastern Europe or South America, get some references of folks who worked with that organization, and now you can have a conversation about what you're looking for, about what they were looking for when they brought that team in, and what they got, and what that you can have some really insightful conversations with other people who've used that vendor.
How important is it when you're hiring a remote team that you or your team has some skill set, that you have the skill set that you're hiring for? So as an example, say your team is deep into database and data science, and that's in sort of back-end server technologies, and you're looking for help in the graphical user interface, React, Angular, sort of front end. How important is it that you have some of that sort of React, Angular, whichever the graphical interface you want, expertise it yourself, versus that's something that you can completely outsource?
So there's a couple of different situations there. First of all, if you're hiring consultants, they're not full-time employees, you might look for something different than if you're trying to hire full-time. If you're trying to hire full-time, you don't necessarily have to have all those experiences, okay? Although you have to be able to judge whether they're doing it accurately and adequately, okay? So you have to know enough about it to be able to manage it, okay? But if you're hiring consultants, you're looking actually for people who actually have expertise that you don't have, okay? And you're trying to bring that in, usually for a limited amount of time until you can build that expertise internally, or if the project is a finite duration, you don't need it anymore. But I've hired consultants as experts where I have no idea what they're doing, specifically to solve specific problems for me. So it really depends on the situation.
So
Even when we're bringing in employees and consultants into areas that you know, we've got patents in, you know, if we've been managing for very long, we become more and more separated from the technology itself. Our skill set, we're hiring people who are better than we are. I'm always, I don't know about you, but I'm always hiring people who are better than I am.
So to that extent, if it is something that you don't have sort of depth in, how can you evaluate whether your consultant, your external team is doing a good job?
Well, how do you determine whether anyone is doing a good job? But frankly, it's driven by results. If they're not delivering results that you can quantify, then you're probably not managing it correctly.
Right. So we're running, it's past sort of 11:30 here on the West Coast. Ron or Mickey, do you have anything that you wanted me to have asked you, or is there anything that you want to add as we're sort of wrapping up our session here?
I think, yeah, the summary of my own talk is worth repeating, which is that there is real gratification to be had in managing, and you have to be willing to let go of the incredible ecstasy of solving hard programming problems, and recognize that what you're doing is creating an environment for an entire team or an entire organization to get that ecstasy, and that we are together building an opportunity for delighting customers.
And just let me go back to what I would like to summarize is managing remotely is hard. It's even harder than managing all these programmers we've been doing over the years because of the distance, time, and culture aspects that impede communication. So we have a favorite saying in our book, which is, you can never over communicate. And I think that in managing remotely, that goes double. So managing programmers remotely is a challenge. Communicate as much as you can and do as much as you can to make it even easier on yourself and on them.